in real estate, protecting your agency. I'm Michael Parent and I'll be hosting today's session, and joining me are Peter Lynch and Bastian Treptow. I'm Aon's national cyber insurance leader with 15 plus years of experience in the insurance industry. Peter is Aon's real estate relationship manager and has worked for Aon for over 30 years and has been involved in all facets of the real estate insurance throughout that time. Bastian is a cybersecurity expert who set up his own company, CTRL, in 2009 and has been saving clients in the war against cybercrime ever since. So Pete, with no further ado, over to you following a quick agenda update. Cyber risk exposures is something that we'll cover off. We'll cover off on some recent incidents within the insurance real estate industry, the mandatory breach reporting requirements and the impacts of these on businesses. And Bastian will also then cover off on the cyber threat landscape, threats versus data, and some case studies. And we'll finish off with where we are, current state and future state. For any further questions, we'll broadcast these through our usual methods. So Pete, with no further ado.
Thank you, Michael. Look, it's interesting first, that statistic there, 85% of all Australians will stop dealing with an organisation that's had their data breached. And this is a big concern for any business, particularly small business, to think that that sort of client will be turned off dealing with you.
I think it's important as well when you look at Australians starting to take cybersecurity more importantly, or basically they're starting to shop around for entities that are going to take their data security seriously. So if you're not in that bucket, then you may be looked over or waved over.
And if we consider the global phenomenon around this as well, we've seen that there are significant shifts in buying trends and share prices for companies who have data incidents or issues, cyber issues, and for those who manage them poorly.
Indeed.
You know, the real estate industry is particularly prone to cyber attacks, and largely driven, of course, by the amount of personal information that a real estate agency collects, particularly in the property management division. There's a large quantity of funds that have been turned over, a lot of private tenant information such as license numbers, bank account details, all stored by the agent. Extremely large use of mobile devices such as iPads and iPhones and laptops. Employee education is a big issue for all small businesses, but particularly in the real estate industry, there is a high turnover of staff, and certainly from an Aon perspective, we are really strongly encouraging the growth of a cyber-centric office. In other words, what I mean by that is that there's an education process. Offices regularly run training sessions for salespeople, they run training sessions for property management. Cyber has got to be part of that training for both divisions to protect the business.
And it's an important point you make there, Peter. We spent a bit of time on the dark web seeing what some of these malicious entities are talking about. And Australia is a hot topic because we're seen as a soft target. And real estate agents, you know, with servers underneath the receptionist desks and potentially unsafe data keeping habits, are a real hot target and often an easy target. So we're here to discuss some things that hopefully we can do to remove that risk and transfer that risk.
Yeah, thanks, Bastian. I think this last point here, that the industry being an early adopter, look, I mean, I, like everyone in the industry, is excited by the new software, applications that are being brought in, operating systems that are making the life of the real estate agent so much better, artificial intelligence, all of that is fantastic. But of course, with every bit of new technology that comes in, there's create new risks, and those new risks then got to be caught up with by the insurance industry and by the protection industry that you provide, Bastian.
Indeed, yes, it's a bit of a game of cat and mouse.
So the top exposures for the real estate agent: email attacks, phishing, spear phishing, whaling, business email compromise, ransomware. This is where your operating system is actually shut down. And traditionally at the moment, this seems to be the most common attack that is happening for the real estate agent is the ransomware. The ransomware on physical systems, this is where we start talking about the Internet of Things, where the hacker takes control and actually shuts down. It could be an air conditioning system, it could be a security cameras, it could be anything. So that's your ransomware on the physical. Your malware is a worrying one, where, you know, a virus sits within your systems, gathering data and information, and it's almost sitting there like a silent enemy, waiting to attack you when and if they feel they've got so much information that they can use.
Well, even we've seen a recent shift in the last year or so where, criminals want to make money without going to jail. And something we're seeing now is people saying their systems are getting slow. We're seeing a lot of people complain about it. And it's the IT guys discovering that crypto mining software is running on all these machines. So it's almost a victimless crime apart from productivity. And it's an easy way for malware to get onto a system and mine crypto for a criminal. So yeah, it's been really interesting the last 12 months. And again, it all goes back to usually an injection point via email. And email traditionally was never meant to be a secure system, and it's just far too easy a gateway and continues to be too easy a gateway for injecting malware and viruses and all sorts of nasty things into organisations.
And it's a major concern, Bastian. The last point there, cloud computing. In this last couple of months, it's been interesting, and the presentations I've been involved in, and with the CPD sessions, any number of principals or owners of businesses have come up to me at the end and said, I don't really need to worry about this because I've shifted all of my business onto the cloud, so I've really got nothing to be concerned about. And, my standard response to that is, have you looked at the contract between yourself and your cloud provider, because they disclaim any responsibility for any of the issues. The other chief concern is that under the Privacy Act, the primary collector of information always will remain the one responsible for that breach, and it's a non-delegable duty.
That's right. It's interesting as well. Yes, the issues such as patching and firewalls have moved to the cloud supplier, but the challenge has changed. It's really become about identity and access management. All these cloud solutions are available from anywhere. So the challenge for organizations now is to really find out, or make sure, I should say, that the end user that you're allowing to use this cloud software is actually them. From an attacker's point of view, we move to trying to capture credentials of users, and then we can very easily gain control of the cloud systems. And you're right there, Peter, that the buck stops at the people who actually enter the data or own the data in the system. It doesn't go to the cloud provider. So something to take very seriously.
This, I would say, would be the screen that no one wants to get to work tomorrow morning and find. This is the one that says that everything that you might hope to avoid has happened. And there you are. There's your ransomware.
Yep.
Pay up or you're not operating.
So there's some really interesting statistics as well that we've seen from these CryptoLocker attacks. In the SME space, broadly speaking, about 1/3 of companies end up paying the CryptoLockers, so for the decryption keys. But unfortunately, it's circa 50% of the time it's successful, which is not a great statistic to have. And let's also keep in mind that even if you do buy and it all seems to work fine, you just don't know what else have embedded in your systems. You don't know what else you're going to wake up to.
Well, it's a massive double-edged sword. You've got these organisations like the Australian Federal Police and our American counterparts that are shutting down these servers left, right and centre. But if you're the poor bloke who's just paid up the fairly decent fine and they've shut down the server, they've also shut down your means of getting your encryption key, which is a nasty surprise to wake up to after you've already paid somewhere between $2,000 and $8,000 per device that you need to recover your data from.
Well, that's scary. I want to now just go through a few of these recent claims examples and talk to them, and I'd really encourage you, Bastian, if you want to throw any comments in on these, or Michael on these recent claims. This one is first one here is 3 separate agents, the subject of ransomware attacks. The hacker sought a ransom payable in Bitcoin, and the ransoms varied from between $1,250 to $8,000. One agent paid a $3,000 ransom to gain the decryption key. However, the agent's operating system was compromised and some files did not decrypt correctly, and the insurer reimbursed the ransom. In all 3 claims, luckily, the insurer considered the policy being triggered and reimbursed the expenses incurred in repairing the system.
One of the comments I'd love to make is, does anyone realize how to even create a Bitcoin wallet and transact these sorts of things? So the level of sophistication that these guys are coming in at are probably above your average SME's knowledge on how to even deliver a Bitcoin payment. Thankfully, most of these guys will actually offer that as a service as well and charge you for it. It's very kind of them. But it is, the use of this technology is becoming harder and harder for your average SME client to manage, and the real estate industry is certainly finding these challenges themselves as well.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I find a little bit frustrating. when our clients come to us and say we've been hit by ransomware, a lot of the time the method that they're using to inject these evil packets or even executables into the system, they should have been patched years ago. Like a lot of this software. So if you actually put your evil hat on and you decide tomorrow that you want to go and actually infect some computers with ransomware, you'll go onto the dark web, you'll pay for a bit of software, you'll download it, you'll set up your wallets and you'll send it out. But most of this software is quite old. There's only a few people writing good, clever, malicious software. So from our point of view, it's frustrating that we're still seeing these things happen when literally the latest patches, not even any particularly defensive software in place, would stop 99% of these things.
Oh, geez, that's interesting indeed. Look, this next example here, this is a Brisbane agent opened an email purportedly from a utility company. It contained malicious malware which locked down the agency's computer network. The agent did engage their own IT consultant to investigate. The insurer ultimately considered the costs incurred by the consultant were reasonable and necessary, given the extent of the damage, and agreed to reimburse the expenses incurred in the amount of $12,000. Unbelievably, the agent had a second claim where a virus malware again entered the system via an email disguised as a bill this time. 68 hours spent repairing the computer system. Again, the costs were incurred considerably reasonable and necessary, and that was for $9,800. You might make some comment on that hours spent there, Bastian.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially wasted time, and I think it's something that most organisations today, with the clever tools that are available at a fairly affordable price, should be able to avoid. And again, to your point before, Michael, you don't know how far these things are going to continue on down the line. Once your systems have been compromised, you're basically having sleepless nights wondering, is it still working out there? It's not a great place to be in.
And the other thing to keep in mind is, again, if there's any sort of ransomware payments, you don't know whether you're now on a list in the dark web as an easy target. So it's one of those cascading events that you just never know where it's going to end.
Yeah, well, interesting. The stats I think we touched on the first slide. Once you've been hit once, you're 3 times more likely to be hit again.
Right, now I want to touch on the most recent changes to the Privacy Act, which is a notifiable data breach Act, which came in on the 22nd of February of this year. Organisations covered by the Privacy Act are required to investigate suspected data breach and notify eligible data breaches to affected individuals and to the Officer of the Australian Information Commissioner. Who does it apply to? Well, look, it applies to Australian government agencies, both state and local, all businesses, including not-for-profits with an annual turnover of more than $3 million, the private health sector, and that can be providers of any size, credit reporting agencies of any size, and holders of one or more tax file numbers. I'd probably like you to comment, Bastian. I get a lot of agents that look at me and say, wow, well, I don't earn $3 million. I can just completely forget about all this. It doesn't apply to me. What would you say to an agent that thinks that way?
Well, again, I go back to the point that this legislation is a good thing for Australia, and consumers are looking for people to take their data seriously. If you have a management attitude that, I don't need to comply, then I don't think that's a good starting point. Again, these things like a private health record, a credit record, or a tax file number, it's hard to say with any real certainty that in your entire organisation that data is not looming out there somewhere. And that could be in an email system, emailed to you from a third-party vendor or a client. I would say that most people need to take this seriously. I would say that nearly all organisations basically need to comply. And the other scary thing is some of the timeframes for reporting. So I usually ask our clients, hand on heart, if we breach your system, can you tell me that we've been in there? And do you also have the systems to tell you what I've touched, what I've taken, and report that within the timeline? Otherwise, the fines are pretty egregious. It was $360,000 per director per breach.
420 now.
420, it's gone up, apologies, and $1.8 million for the company.
Up to 2.1.
Up to 2.1.
Yep.
It's
getting worse.
It's getting worse.
As we sit here. Yeah.
So it's important to take this seriously, and it can be done, as we'll touch on later, in a relatively logical way that's not going to cost you the earth.
So another way to maybe look at this as well is maybe potentially you don't need to comply with the notification requirement. That's not going to help you, however, from your reputational harm if and when this hits the public domain. If you're trying to edge through some legislation, it'll look even worse for you, I would suggest. So the reputational harm component of not complying or not living to a standard is something to consider. And keep in mind, right now, we know the OAIC don't have necessarily the full resources to investigate all of the issues. They've basically given us a 12-month period of comply as best you can and everything will be good. At some point, the bar will be lowered so that you will need to comply, we suggest. And it's a really good culture now of just really good time to get used to the culture of proactively managing these sorts of issues.
I think we touch on the next slide, but it's important. We've actually gone and spoken to the governing body, and they do have a list of businesses they are aware of had breaches and have not reported. Now, it says on their website that they're trying to work with businesses. They are trying to help businesses for the next 12 months, or 12 months from the 22nd of February to the 22nd of February 2019. Then this is only my opinion, but I think for the Australian public to take it seriously, they're going to come down with a bit of a hammer, and hopefully your name's not on that list.
And look, what is an eligible data breach? Look, you could put out a whole lot of prescribed ideas, but look, I think the simplest thing to say is it could be any minor breach of privacy that gives away personal information. And I think if you take that simplistic view of it, that you have actually given away some of this personal information, you should consider that eligible. Let them decide when you report it whether it's worthwhile or not, and then you've covered yourself and protected you.
Exactly. That you can report to them, and they will quite happily say to you, "Thank you for reporting it. This doesn't actually constitute a notifiable breach, but thank you very much." Instantly, your reputation with them is going to be in good stead and somewhere where you'd like to be.
Perfect.
Well, what do you do if a breach does occur? You've got to carry out an assessment within 30 days to determine whether there has been a breach. And Bastian, please jump in here anytime you like on this. If the assessment leads to belief that there's an eligible breach has occurred, the organisation must notify the affected individual, the Officer of Information. The organisation must complete a notification statement which describes the types of breaches and the kinds of information concerned, and the steps the individual should take in response to the breach.
I might just add something in there as well, and this is again my interpretation, so I'm happy to be corrected. But that window of 30 days is the maximum period you've got to investigate the issue. I feel fairly strongly that if day 2 you've come to a very solid position that it has been a breach, you need to notify straight away. Don't play on the extra 28 days. I think the OAIC will probably come down on people in 12 months harder who try to play it a longer game. So just be mindful of that. If you got to a position that you are very confident, notify.
I mean, if we look at some of the larger corporates in Australia that sat on things way back since 2015, we won't name any names, but they've been named and shamed in the media, and I don't think it's done much for their reputation. So yeah, be on the front foot and really have a good hard look at yourself and answer the question, would you be able to detect a breach? And by that I mean someone maliciously coming into your organisation over the network or physically and accessing your data. I'd say the answer to a lot of companies at the moment in Australia is no, they don't have the technology to detect it.
And I think if the eligible breach has occurred and you've taken all the remedial action, well, there's no need to be really reporting that, is there?
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, from my point of view, you're better off to report kind of everything, but yeah, if you can stand hard, essentially it says you must have taken all reasonable steps. So it's again a bit of a grey area in the.
So once again, you'd say the safest action would be to report it and be told that you don't need to. Then
I would suggest so, yes.
Yeah. And critically, I think what we're trying to get across as well is that once it has happened, act and proactively manage and proactively do whatever you can to minimise harm. That, for one, will help with the reputational component, but 2, it also may help with the legal requirements component as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some examples of companies that have done it well, they've had a breach and they were in the media for sure, but it was put in a positive light. They had a breach, they did the right thing, these are the steps. By Monday, everyone's forgotten about it. The guys who haven't been proactive and then they're in the media for negative reasons, it lasts for months and months, and the reputational harm is immeasurable.
Yeah, very significant. What if you don't comply? Well, the civil fines and penalties up to 2.1 million. for the entity and 420,000 from an individual. Compensation orders to individuals have suffered loss or damage. There could be enforceable undertakings.
So Pete, when did that go up to 2.1 million?
It was earlier this year, so part of the standard government fines and penalties increases. When it was first contemplated, it was 1.8, but the standard increase that the government applies, I think, over a 3-year period, so that triggered earlier this year.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And certainly, you don't want to be being given enforceable undertakings, you don't want injunctions, and you certainly wouldn't want to receive a notice that they've got a power of entry to be checking on your documentation, and it could ultimately end up in a hearing as well.
Yes, indeed.
This is an interesting statistic, and I'm probably going to ask both of you gentlemen to hop in here on this one. The report says that, April to June of 2018 reveals that there were 242 notifications. 36% were a result of human error, 59% of malicious or criminal acts, and 5% system faults. Look, I've specifically put a question mark there because I say to myself, how many have remained unnotified?
Yeah, I think both Bastian and I are individually aware of separate companies that haven't notified. One that I'm acutely aware of believe they didn't need to notify for whatever particular reason, and they've now fallen afoul of some contractual issues that they've got. So even not notifying whether or not there's a question as to whether you do need to comply with the NDB, it is still, I think, best prudent position to take the assumption that you do need to notify. This issue for this client, it will be a company ending event.
Yeah, I mean, again, I go back to we know that they have a list of organisations that have not complied as opposed to the guys who have done the right thing. So you probably don't want to be on that list. And it's actually really interesting as well. You look at those stats, 36% were a result of human error. You need to have systems in place to detect that as well.
Yep.
Does that go back to the earlier points there about the need for staff education and training, Bastian? It really doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Need for staff training and education, but also technology in place that can actually monitor these things. We have amazing tools in place today. So things from artificial intelligence, which admittedly is a marketing term, but process automation and policies and training and all these things can go in place to the staff know that they shouldn't do these things, and then technology in place to make sure they don't do these things. And it's really simple things. Like we tell our clients, if they see something they don't know in the building, just something as simple as how's your weekend, if the question's answered the wrong way, is a very powerful tool to see that someone shouldn't be there.
Yeah, exactly. And look at this last slide of mine here. Look, what's going to be the result? What is actually the impact on your business once you've had a cyber incident? And there's a whole range of costs that are going to start to happen. The cost of a public relations cost response, that's going to be heavy. There's going to be a revenue loss, there's no doubt about that one. And we've covered through the slides previously, there's a heavy cost of restoration. There's defence costs. Regards the third parties, they're potentially going to seek, civil penalties and awards. That once again, consequential loss for them, and once again, also on their behalf, your third parties will be looking to you to get back whatever cost that they feel you've caused on their systems. And with this moving forward, with the Internet of Things, I think the real concern, and I also would take point here. This is a major concern for commercial real estate agents, is the Internet of Things, commercial shopping managers that have got control of, air conditioning systems, security systems, all of those things, lifts, escalators, all have got the ability to be hacked and not only create physical damage to that property, but personal injury to the people that are using them. And this is a huge exposure for commercial property managers and leasing agents.
Often overlooked. You look at the Target hack a few years ago. They used the HVAC system as a third-party contractor to get into the environment. We've seen a few hacks where critical infrastructure, SCADA systems, which are used to control things like gas pipeline pressures and train signaling systems that could have huge impacts, are often connected to these third-party systems like air conditioners, lifts, you name it.
And I know there's been some huge claims in the United States with firms like Target, where they've used third-party air conditioning repair and caused problems. So yeah, it is a huge issue.
At the end of the day, if you think about your network, it applies to third parties, and those third parties can have real-world consequences if something was to go wrong. Criminals are getting better and better at getting where they want to get. Sometimes they can't get into the targets of the world directly because they do deploy some very, very sophisticated security measures. Criminals will proactively target the weakest link in the chain to get where and what they want, and that can have impact on the physical world.
And I suppose that's why we see this growth on attacks on SMEs and small business.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys, so I guess I have a little bit of a unique viewpoint here. So my organisation runs 3 parts. We essentially get paid to be the bad people, which is kind of fun. We get paid to hack into organisations, and the other part of the business is we get to help organisations develop strategies around what they should do to prevent being on the front page, and some of those strategies relate to why we're here today, talking to the likes of Aon about insurance and transferring risk. And the other part of my business, the third part, is the controlling side. So essentially guys working actively to prevent attacks. And because we see all 3 components, it gives us a bit of a unique insight into how the thinking of my black hat team or white hat team get into organisations, like you were saying, Michael, versus how we get around those from a compliance point of view and a strategy point of view, versus the guys who are actually trying to put out the fires once a breach has happened. So we'll move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about some of the things that we saw in 2017 and 2018. So obviously ransomware, it's hugely important in the real estate world. It's probably one of the bigger attacks that we've seen. Again, it's something that should be pretty easy to prevent by using just as simple as patching, or even some new technology out there called virtual patching, which essentially means you don't have to patch. You can present your system as whatever you want it to the outside world. We saw the Equifax hack. We saw 143 million compromised social security numbers. Yesterday or today we saw BA. We saw the NDIS got breached as well. So they're happening fast and quick, and 2018 is just going up and up.
That's a huge number today too, though, isn't it, Basham? 380,000 people affected by the BA attack. It's huge.
Yeah. And these are just going to get worse and worse and more common and common. And we're working with a number of different industries, including the airline industry, from all facets to try to bridge some of these gaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard landscape to navigate at the moment. I mean, 1 in 131 emails contains malware. And we touched on it before, but the criminals don't want to be caught. They essentially want to make money. The cost, or sorry, the benefit of cybercrime, I should say, has overtaken every other economic form in the world as of last year. It was many years ago that it overtook the adult entertainment industry, and now it's overtaken all forms in terms of criminal activities. So there's a lot of reason to get into it for the we'll call them the bad guys. And then in 2018, 2019, we've seen some really clever things. So we talked about artificial intelligence before.
We did.
We talked about process automation. As much as that makes your job easier, it's also making our job easier from a malicious point of view. So instead of say sending out a malicious attack against 2 or 3 IP addresses, we can now use process automation to hit 50,000 IP addresses. So your likelihood of an attack in 2018 is significantly higher than it was in 2017, and 2019 is going to be a buckle your seatbelts kind of ride. So again, I just want to talk about some of the costs. Like, we've seen it increase significantly. So we're going to see something like $6 trillion spent annually by 2021. And I'm trying to labour a point here that the costs are going up. The spending on prevention is going up. And for smaller organisations, even your tier 2 organisations, you've got a 0% unemployment rate for the security guys that are trying to prevent this stuff, because there's so much demand. So it really raises the question, what do you do to prevent this sort of stuff? What are some intelligent things you can do? And we'll try and cover off on that in a second.
And I think that's a good point, Bash. One of the points that I wanted to speak about earlier was, and Mike, you and I have spoke about this a lot in depth, affecting the real estate industry, is the dual authentication. We've seen funds redirected, unfortunately, whereby, you know, an agent has relied on an email that has given a new BSB and account number, and I've been very strong talking about the need for dual authentication, that it's a fantastic excuse to ring your client up and say, you know, I've received this email, changing bank account details. Do you mind if I just run through and check with you? And then, did you actually send me this email? Michael, you've got some thoughts on the dual authentication?
Well, I mean, single factor authentication is completely inadequate. It's negligent, I mean, in today's world. Dual factor is a great step, but even then we probably should be thinking multi-factor, because these guys, and we've seen it happen, these guys are very good now at getting into systems, compromising phones, compromising email addresses, compromising text messages. Having extra layers is fundamental.
To give you an idea, so far since 2009, our organisation has been paid, as I said, to hack into organisations from a good point of view to try and expose risk. We've got a 100% breach record. So that shows the tenacity of the guys who work in the industry, to dog with a bone sort of stuff. Can't get in that way. What's another way to get through? But most of the time we find these little soft areas in it, you know, the soft underbelly of the business. And I use the analogy, when you're targeting an organisation, it's very similar to a lion in Africa looking for the weak animal, the one with the lame leg or the young. You've got to try and stop those kinds of vulnerabilities existing in your network. And one of the strategies, we'll move on to the next slide, for doing that is a data-centric approach. So years ago, and even a lot of organisations today, basically the way that they dealt with threats is they tried to understand all the threats out there. And you know, the CVE database at the moment has something like 100,000 available threats that can be exploited. Very easily searched, very easy, public knowledge. And organisations tried to wrap controls around those things. And you don't actually know how many threats are out there because they're coming out every day, and there's zero-day exploits. Someone out there creating a new piece of code, we won't know about it for weeks or months. You can't wrap a control around that. And if you try and wrap a control around it, like the banks do this very effectively because they hire teams of 300 or 400 people, and they're essentially putting out fires. It ends up being very resource intensive, and at the end of the day, you don't really know what your residual risk is because you don't know what the initial threats are. So a new way, and it's really in line with things like the GDPR and the Notifiable Breaches Act, is to define what data your organisation has and very clearly map controls around that specific data. And the first step of that is to actually categorise your data. So it'd be a really interesting question for everyone out there to have a think to yourself, have you actually defined what data you have in your organisation? If you haven't, how can you even possibly conceive what the risks are or even what the compliance requirements are? But once you've done that, you can put controls around it, and you can be very limited on your resources because you only have to put these certain controls around. And then after that, you know if a particular control is hit, you know what your residual risk is. So for example, if your firewall has a vulnerability, you know that's going to affect your this and this data set. And it's a smarter way to go about it. It's more in line with the new legislations, particularly GDPR, which I think is quite a good one. And it interestingly affects a lot of Australian businesses, despite most of them thinking that they're not required to comply with it.
And it seems to me we're leading back again to this education and training, don't we? I mean,
Exactly, yeah. So maybe we'll move on to a bit of a case study. So first of all, I want to really hammer this point in. So PEXA are one of those organisations who have done the right thing. They've done all the right things. They've had testing, they've had compliance, they've self-reported, and it's actually a really valuable lesson for us in a positive sense, that they basically have showed us what you should do. They've gone in, so we'll go over the attack. So essentially, it wasn't even really PEXA's system that was breached. At the end of the day, it was a third party that was using their system that was breached. And it goes back to what Peter was saying before. Essentially, what they did was got control of an email system. And again, I really labour that point that email should not be used under any circumstances for transmission of secure data. It really is a weakness. If you try and get ISO compliance, for example, and you're sending data by email, you won't ever get that certificate. Anyway, so they basically got into this system. They reset the username and password of the PEXA system via the email. Then they set up an additional account, and then they edited the settlement details prior to them being re-encrypted back into the system, and they gained access, and they were able to redirect funds. A significant amount of funds, and I think it negatively affected particularly a family. But what I want to talk about here is why did this happen? They've gone through and done the right things. They've had third-party security assessments. They've gone and got it tested. They've got compliance. Why did this happen? And I think it goes back to that slide we were at previously. You're trying to do that threat-centric model. And a lot of security people or even business owners are thinking all we need to protect against is that compromise. So we're stopping attackers getting into our system and stealing data. The organizations are forgetting about integrity and accountability. And integrity is a hugely important one here. So all they did was change some numbers and it ended up costing real world money.
And once again, the brand and reputation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And despite, I think they haven't been too badly affected because they have done the right things and it's important. And it's a great lesson for all the other organizations out there to follow in their footsteps. But yeah, let's never forget about the integrity of data. Do you have systems that prevent it from being changed? And in this case, PEXA have gone in, they've implemented a fantastic system that actually makes sure that the systems are cross-checked and the integrity of the data is checked, and the end user that owns the data is advised if bank accounts and details are changed and things like that. That's a very simple control which would have completely prevented this attack. And we'll move on to another one. So again, a little bit related to the real estate field. So this is a large builder. They build their own commercial properties and then they sell them themselves through their own sales network. This particular attacker gained access to the internal network and they watched for many months. So you can't really put your hand on your heart and say if an attacker's in your system for many months that you had the devices and software in there to detect them. So instantly you kind of know that they're not really compliant with the notified data breaches, GDPR. Even these particular guys have an ISO certificate and obviously they're in breach of that as well. So this guy has watched for many months and he's found that the supply chain, once you enter yourself into the system as supplier, as long as it's not associated to a project, you can instantly issue yourself invoices. So this guy's smashing out invoices and it wasn't discovered for over 3 weeks that $10 million had exited the bank account. Now these guys transfer $150 million in and out of their bank accounts every day because they're dealing with large transactions. But this day and age, I don't think it's acceptable to have a malicious entity in an environment moving data in and out and not having simple control. So this essentially goes down to accountability. So we've gone, confidentiality has remained intact, integrity has remained intact, but the accountability of who is changing data within your system, that's where they've fallen over. So again, we go back to that slide. If you have controls around your data and you can verify your CIA, not the American CIA, but confidentiality, integrity, and accountability is in place, you're going to block a lot of these attacks. And simple things. So Peter, I think you mentioned before about some of the 2-factor and 3-factor authentication.
Yep.
There's new technology out there, which we're actually proud to have developed one of the versions of it, that allows you to look at the way people are typing. So for example, if you're using your computer, Peter, and you told me your username and password, if you have a 3-factor authentication system installed, I can try and type in your password, but I don't type like you. You might type it faster or slower, or you might hit a key harder.
So you don't use one finger?
Oh. I try and use my toes for something a bit different. But we can now see with these really simple technology solutions that I am not the normal user of your device, and that will block a lot of attacks. Other things like virtual patching that exist, other things like people actually watching your data logs with security incident event monitoring solutions are all things that can be really easily put in place, and this day and age for a very affordable price to cover 90% of your breaches. And the other thing, and one of the main reasons that I partnered with you guys at Aon is one of our clients essentially had insurance and the cyber insurance didn't pay out. I think it's really important that you guys go through the steps of really making sure that cyber cover is going to protect my valuable clients. And I was really impressed with you guys actually going through the depth of saying, you know what, these guys need to make these tweaks to make sure that this cover will pay out.
Yeah. Michael, I'd like to seek a comment from you on this because, one thing that I believe is happening so quickly is the changing landscape of risk within cyber and the keeping up with this risk from an insurance perspective. Would you like to make some comments on that?
Yeah, so the insurance has come from old world thinking, where we all know the risks. We all know what a property policy does because they've existed for hundreds of years. Cyber insurance has been born from that world. So it's using old world terminology to try to treat new world exposures. The broadly speaking, intellectual property, IP, has really only been developed over, say, 20 to 30 years. And if anyone knows anything about the insurance industry, it's slow to change. So I really think that the cyber insurance needs to start to become a little bit more dynamic, and we're certainly getting there. We're getting there to the point where insurers are much more proactive around these sorts of terminologies and approaches, and it's fundamentally shifted how insurance should be considered. I no longer talk about insurance as in actual insurance for the liability protection. I talk about it for access to vendors, because that will 9 out of 10 times take care of a problem far better than relying on the liability component, which is a drawn out old draconian approach to a solution. So that's kind of my point. One of the takeaways that I like to give to clients, or one or two of the takeaways that I like to give, you're not perfect. No one is perfect, but some simple changes to process can be very advantageous. One of the things I like to focus on for people with low levels of or limited ability to deploy assets and finances into improving systems is to have a very good password management process. You don't need to, you can, but you don't need to deploy additional technology. It's just raising your approach to passwords.
Having something simple like an incident response plan in place, you don't spend $1 apart from the time. Exactly, having the policies in place there will hugely improve. I agree. And I like to basically tell our clients, don't look at cybersecurity as this annoying thing. Look at it as a positive. Look at it as an advantage that you can have over your competition to say, we take cybersecurity seriously, we take your data seriously, and we will take all steps required to prevent anything bad happening to your important and personal information. And like we said before, consumers are actually looking at that as a selling point. So if you've got all the boxes ticked, then it's definitely an advantage.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. We've finished our webinar. We hope we've left you with some positive sights, some positive aspects to the risk. Sure, there are lots of risks, but there are lots of advantages now, and we hope that this has been helpful for you.
And I think, the final point here is that for all the businesses out there, it's a combination of risk transfer, being insurance, and risk management. And you can't have one without the other. It's got to be risk management and insurance to try and manage risk as best as possible.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.